Hey guys, Mr. Champlin here. Today we're going to be talking about the groups of mammals. So the first group is the monotremes. And the monotremes, these are the earliest mammals that evolved. And these are the egg-laying mammals. And they evolved around the early Cretaceous period. And they're still around, although there's not very many species. There's very few. So they were the first ones to evolve. Then the second group to evolve were the marsupials. And I'm sure you've heard of the marsupials. They, again, evolved around the middle of the Cretaceous period, and they are still around. And sort of what is characteristic of these animals is that they have a short gestation period and a long lactation period. So we're going to talk about that, what that means. So, of course, I know you've heard of things like kangaroos and wombats and possums and things like that. Those would all be marsupials. And then in the late Cretaceous period, we had evolved the placental mammals. And the placental mammals, their big characteristic is, of course, the long gestation period and a short lactation period. So we'll talk about sort of how that relates to what the marsupials are doing. So the some examples of some placental mammals would be bats, primates, rodents like mice and rats, and whales. These would all be placental mammals. All right, so first the monotremes. So mono, of course, means one. So monotreme literally means one opening. So like the reptiles and the birds that we've already talked about, they have a cloaca, and this is just one opening where everything comes out. Urine, feces, eggs, and sperm. It all just comes out this one hole. So again, very much like the reptiles and the birds, which makes sense because these mammals did evolve from the reptiles. In addition, they have another reptilian characteristic, and that is that they lay eggs. So they're young, they come out in eggs. So with all this, a reptilian, characteristics, how can we say that definitively they are mammals? Well, for one thing, they have hair. They definitely have hair, so that makes them mammals. But what's also very mammal-like is the fact that once the young hatch from the egg, they are nourished by the mother's milk. So now they don't have teats or nipples like most mammals, but they do have the glands that produce the milk. So the mother will usually flip over and she'll extrude the milk through the pores on the underside of her body, and the young will lap it up. Now there's not too many monotremes left. We have the duck-billed platypus, which I'm sure you've heard of before. So that would be considered a monotreme, and at one time they were 20 or 30 different types. Now there's just one species. And the spiny echidna, there are actually two species. And here's what they look like here. So they do have a kind of a beak-like structure similar to the platypus, but it's much narrower, and they kind of have this spiny, this sort of spiny structure. So these are the only monotremes that are still around. At one time, there was probably many, many species of monotremes. Now we just have 3. All right, our next group that we want to talk about really quickly are the marsupials. So again, kangaroos would be the classic example of a marsupial, and Australia is filled with marsupials. Now these are born very premature, but they have well-developed front legs, and so when they're born, they actually use these front legs to crawl up to the pouch. So once they get into the pouch, or the marsupium, as the technical term is, they will attach to a teat or a nipple, and they will feed, and they will finish up developing and growing inside the pouch. And then, of course, once they reach a certain stage of a development, they can leave the pouch for short periods of time, and of course, those become increasingly longer and longer as they start eating normal food. So again, most of the marsupials live in Australia, although we do have one marsupial that lives around here. Oh, by the way, here's a picture. This guy is pulling open the kangaroo's pouch. Can't imagine she likes that too much, but you can see in here the little baby kangaroo that was essentially just born, and it's attached to the teat here. And you can see it is weird looking, very alien looking. No hind legs, no hind limbs. Yeah, it just smells its way to the pouch, and it attaches there and finishes growing. So marsupials, they spend very little time in the womb or the uterus, and they finish developing in this pouch. Now, marsupials actually evolved in South America, and when the land masses were connected, they made their way to Australia. Then, of course, the land masses moved apart from one another, and Australia was sort of an island, and the marsupials were able to evolve into many different forms. Well, here in the Americas, where they originally sort of started, the marsupials didn't fare too well. Once the placental mammals evolved, they kind of took over, and most of the marsupials died off. However, there are still a few marsupials around. There are 2 species of marsupials that live in South America, and 1 species that lives in North America. So if you haven't figured it out yet, the marsupial species that lives here in North America is the possum. So these are very common around here, although you typically don't see them because they come out at night. But I see them, dead on the side of the road all the time when I'm driving to and from school. In fact, that's true for most mammals. Most mammals only come out at night. Think of like deer or like raccoons. I mean, think about the last time when you saw a raccoon or a deer walking around. You probably don't see them that often, just once in a great while. And that's because they're very shy. They only come out at night, and they really stay away from people. So this sort of shyness and this being active at night probably evolved very early in the mammals when they had to avoid predators, especially dinosaurs. And they've sort of held on to this mode of living, and most mammals are very shy and only will come out at night. There are a few exceptions, of course, but for the most part. So the possums are similar, that they are nighttime. They spend a lot of time in the trees, so you don't see them that often, just once in a while. Just every once in a while I'll see one, a possum that is trying to get into my garbage or something. But they're pretty shy. So as I mentioned, in Australia and New Zealand, the marsupials really evolved. They really radiated out and evolved into many different forms. So of course you have kangaroos, which are kind of like the deer of Australia. They eat grass and they form these herds. This is a picture of a Tasmanian devil, which is an actual real thing. The koalas, I'm sure you've heard of those. This down here is, I think it's called a bandicoot, and this is essentially a marsupial mouse. And then in the lower left-hand corner here, we see this sort of lemur-looking, monkey-looking thing. So again, they have radiated and they have filled many of the ecological niches in Australia, and they have evolved to parallel many of the forms that we see in the placental mammals. Down below here, this is a marsupial mole, and so looks very much like the moles that we have around here. And then up here, this is a black and white photo because these are actually extinct. The last one died in the zoo in, I think, 1910. But this is a sort of a dog-like creature. Again, it's not a dog. It's a marsupial, but they have evolved to have very similar forms. And this was called a marsupial wolf back in the day. They have since gone extinct. People have killed every last one of them. So this is a good time to bring up convergent evolution. So as far as the marsupial mammals and the placental mammals, many of the marsupial mammals have evolved to have similar forms, right? So this is a great picture, I think, because it shows you sort of how similar they look. So we already mentioned the Tasmanian wolf here, and of course that is a very dog-like creature. The wombat looks a lot like a woodchuck and would eat similar foods. This marsupial mammal called a tiger cat. It's not a cat and it's not a tiger, but it looks very similar to other types of wild cats that would not be marsupials. The marsupial mole and the sort of regular common European mole look very, very similar. The main difference, of course, being just the color. There are marsupial versions of mice. In fact, there are many of them. The numbat, or the banded anteater, has a it doesn't look so much as the anteaters that sort of we're accustomed to. However, again, they have a very similar lifestyle. If you look at the sugar glider and the flying squirrel of North America, almost exactly the same, even down to the colors. Here they're showing these are striped. These are actually striped too. I had a family of these living in my yard, and my cat managed to kill them all. But they look so much like a sugar glider from Australia that it would take an expert to tell the difference there. So again, convergent evolution, when you have two forms of animals that, even though they're not closely related, they look very similar because they have evolved to live in a similar habitat and to eat similar foods. So just a quick aside about the diversity of mammals. So sort of the age of mammals has already passed. They were in their prime, millions of years ago, and during this time period, there were giant mammals all over the globe. Here in North and South America, there were giant sloths. The saber-toothed cats. Here we see in some kind of weird-looking elephant-like creature. Horses. Horse-like mammals that were very common here in North America. So many of these mammals have since gone extinct. So these giant mammals that really evolved fairly quickly after the dinosaurs went extinct and kind of took over many of the same habitats. Many of them have since gone extinct, and even now we're seeing a really fast extinction of the larger mammals like tigers and elephants and such. So the placental mammals, they're called the eutherians. Eu meaning true, and theria meaning mammals. So this is the larger group by far, and it contains many subgroups, and there are of course thousands and thousands of different placental mammal species. So just really quickly, just to go through some of the ones that you might be familiar with, the carnivores is a very large group. In fact, I think something like 1/3 of all mammal species belong to this group. This would include your dogs and your cats and lions and tigers and bears. I mean, pretty much anything that eats meat would fall into this category. The bats have their own group. And again, this is a huge group, thousands and thousands of bat species, throughout the world. The Ungulates, this would include any of the hoofed mammals like camels and horses and zebras. Then, of course, you have the moles and the hedgehogs. These are the insectivores, so they would eat lots of insects. You have the primates, which we belong to this group. Apes and monkeys and such. Rodents, another really big group, right? So mice and rats and things like that. Sloths and armadillos. These are also, for the most part, insect-eating mammals. Hyraxes, you're probably not too familiar with them, but the elephants have their own group. I think we're down now to two species that are left. But at one time, there would have been, 30 or so different species of elephant-like creatures roaming the earth. The dugongs and the manatees have their own group. Again, they were a much larger group than they are now. I think there's just a few species left. The aardvarks. So there we go. So some of the major groups of the placental mammals. So the thing with the eutherians, what sets them apart from all the other mammals is the placenta. So here you see a picture of a placenta. So what is a placenta? Well, the placenta is essentially a bag of blood vessels. And this bag of blood vessels is what connects, along with the umbilical cord, of course, is what connects the mother to the young. And nutrients or food and gases like oxygen and CO2 and waste products are exchanged through the placenta and the umbilical cord. So this allows the young to remain inside the mother's body for extended periods of time and to grow and to finish developing inside the mother's body. Now, humans are kind of an exception to this rule, but most mammals, many mammals, when they're born, they, half an hour later, they're up and they're walking around and they're eating and doing all the things that mammals do. Carnivores would be an exception to this rule, and certainly primates, right? Because we have such big heads and such big brains, we have to be born kind of early and then finish developing outside our mother's body. So the thing with the eutherians or the placental mammals is they have a long gestation period. So in other words, they're inside the mother's body for a long period of time, and they have a shorter lactation period, so a shorter time when they're drinking milk. Again, humans would be an exception to this rule. If you think about elephants and whales, the mother is pregnant for about 2 years, so that's a long time. But again, it's necessary to have this time to basically make such a huge animal. All right, and so lastly, just wanted to show you this is an actual picture of a human embryo. So you can see it's very early, but this is great because it shows a lot of the not just mammal characteristics, but the characteristics that we associate with the vertebrates. So here you see the umbilical cord. Here's the placenta. By the way, the placenta actually comes from your own cells. So when you are very early in the development of the human embryo, it sort of splits in half. Half of the cells become you, half of the cells become the placenta. Now, when the placenta comes out, if the baby has a disease or something, you could actually use cells from the placenta and from the umbilical cord because those are genetically you. So for example, now it's not uncommon to freeze the placenta and the umbilical cord so that they could get blood from it if they need to replace blood in the baby, because it's essentially your blood. Here you see amniotic sac, which surrounds the embryo. And again, this is a characteristic that we see in birds and reptiles and mammals. So we are even though we don't lay eggs, we are still technically so even though we don't lay eggs, we're still technically amniotes. Here you can see a yolk sac, which again is a sort of a vestige of our reptilian ancestors. So we don't really use it, but it still kind of is there. So yeah, so this is a great picture because again it can show you a lot of the reptilian characteristics that we still have as mammals. All right, I hope that was helpful. Make sure you answer the mammal groups questions, and this is the last assignment for the year.